Welcome to Media Narratives, Building Peace in Polarized Societies. This is an online event hosted by Narrative Peace Building Hub of the Institute for Integrated Transitions. My name is Refik Hodzic. I'm a journalist from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it is my pleasure to spend the next 30 minutes talking to my colleagues, Moky, Makura, and Miguel, Silva. All three of us are members of the Inclusive Narratives Practice Group of the IFIT, or Institute for Integrated Transitions. I'll be using IFIT quite often. In today's conversation, Moky is Executive Director of Africa No Filter, and Miguel is lawyer and communications consultant. Their extensive biographies are going to be provided in the chat of this event. I was asked to give you a little bit of a background in the beginning about the approach to narratives of IFIT, which brought the three of us together in this inclusive narratives practice group. The approach basically has as the main premise the understanding that narratives shape the conflicts and chances of post-conflict recovery in a decisive way. And for this reason, in consultations with various different brain trusts and members of the Inclusive Narrative Practice Group, and a large community of specialized experts, if it developed a very, I would say, interesting and perhaps even exciting approach to trying to promote the concept that single unifying narratives are often a factor in solidifying conflict, and that complexification of these narratives is a dynamic that often contributes to peace building. I invite you to find out more about this work, and especially to visit the page on narrative of Narrative Peace Building Hub, where you will find many interesting papers which address the way that narratives are an integral part both of conflict dynamics, but also of post-conflict interventions. There is a very specific paper on media and narrative that outlines the role of traditional and social media in promoting simplified narratives that drive conflict, which is going to be a topic of today's discussion. But this paper goes in more depth on several areas that personally to me have been subject of interest over the years that I've been involved in transitional justice work. I do very much recommend that you read this paper if you are interested in the topic. I think that today's discussion comes at a very important and I would say worrying moment where we can see that some of the premises, at least that journalists like myself from countries affected by conflict have taken to be kind of the foundations of our approach to journalism, and ethical journalism being a tool to promote values of peace building, like accountability, like ending impunity, like promotion of human rights. Today, even in the media that we thought and took to be somehow uh, beacons and examples of how we should report in an objective and constructive way. Unfortunately, in the polarization that permeates the discourse, political discourse, global discourse, and especially in conflicts like we can see in Gaza, where dehumanization in media that we thought were immune to this is now a normal everyday occurrence. I think that this discussion is both very important and very timely. I'm going to immediately turn to Moky, whose work and mission of Africa No Filter to induce positive change through mass media, I'm sure gives you good insight into the trends and the role of media in countries in Africa in mediating public debates around polarizing issues such as conflict, migration, corruption, inequality. So if you could share with us, what is it that you see of relevance in these trends and roles?
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Refik, and hi to everybody. I think I think I should start by stating something that's very obvious. When you're asked to talk about Africa, I want to make it clear it's very easy to extrapolate something happening in 2 or 3 countries across the continent. So I try and avoid doing that. But I run an organization called Africa No Filter, and we are working on shifting narratives about Africa, the stereotypical ones that most people know. You know, the continent is broken, we're dependent, we seem to lack the agency. And what we work with media, we work with storytellers, you know, because we understand the fundamental basis of trying to change a narrative is to change the stories that feed that narrative. A question I often get asked is, well, you know, what narrative do you want? As if there is a single narrative about Africa that I want. And it goes to exactly the heart of what IFIT's narrative, you know, theory is, that a successful sort of the success of narrative in changing way societies operate, or you know, ensuring that we don't contribute to polarization, is not creating one single so-called better narrative. That doesn't work because it dampens it, you know, it stops other narratives. What we go for is a multiplicity of narratives. That's what we're after. And you know, when we look at the role of media in Africa, there's a couple of trends that I would talk about. One, that on the continent, we are such a diverse group. You know, if you look at Nigeria alone, over 300 ethnic groups. Kenya, over 40 ethnic groups. You know, South Africa, there's at least 5 ethnic groups, you know, Indian, you know, white, colored. And if you look at the languages, so to a certain extent, our media in some way reflects that. And I think that's one thing that saved us. If you look at Nigeria in the north, you know, the Muslim north of the country, it's predominantly Muslim. The newspapers are different there. What people are reading are different there. So when we talk about countries, I feel that in Africa, we are, I guess, going some way towards showing that, you know, a plethora of media is working. There's, you know, media is not one thing. So that's the first thing, that it's not so clear cut. There's one narrative because there's so many different types of media that operate. The other trend that I see is that the most polarizing issue, I think, across most countries that is consistent is when elections come up. And for that, you often need to look at who owns media. And because media is such an expensive toy, and I call it a toy because a lot of people that just don't see the need for it anymore. You know, we can just start up our own, you know, Instagram page and call ourselves a journalist. Media is expensive, content is expensive, fact checking is expensive, you know, just the creation of independent, non-biased content. So a lot of the time, the players who come into the market are very strong, influential players who want to buy influence, particularly on the continent. It's the one way that people have of generating you know, of securing their name, securing their ideology, and it's through media. So you will find in a lot of African countries, there's some very dominant players, media outlets owned by wealthy individuals who want influence. There are in some countries very strong players. Government still remains. In Zimbabwe, you still have the Herald, which is government owned. But the common trend in all of this is that they're not in media for media's sake. They're in media for influence. And that's where media's role as a polarizing force becomes quite obvious in certain countries. And I think the third biggest trend, and I think it's not just an African trend, it's a global trend, is the role of social media. When I ask my daughter, for example, like, how do you get your news? She couldn't name a media brand. She gets it off social media. Wherever that person gets it off could be, somewhere down the line. It could be, the BBC, could be wherever. So the role of independent media brands or any kind of media brands is decreasing, particularly on the continent, where sort of, I guess, not journalists, just individuals who want influence, who already have influence through whatever platforms they have, are using that to become so-called purveyors of news or content. And that you're seeing increasingly more. Facebook, WhatsApp, Telegram are the big platforms where a lot of mis and disinformation is shared. And I think, sometimes, information starts off as disinformation, but often becomes misinformation as it just gets passed on and people actually believe what they're saying. So I don't think there's one unifying thing that I can say about, how media's role in polarization, but the simplicity of often what is needed. When a journalist wants to tell a story, you don't have huge amounts of words. You don't have tons of space to do it. You have 500, 600, 700 pages to tell the story of a coup in your country. Or in some cases, in the case of Africa, when there were 6 coups in 5 countries over an 18-month period, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times did a 700-piece article on 6 coups. How much content, how much context, how much nuance can you speak about? So you take the simple themes that come out. And that for me is the biggest challenge. We think that people are reading less. We think they have less time to read. So media therefore simplifies. And therein lies part of the problem, just the oversimplification of issues, where you bring a story down. In fact, the headline for both the Wall Street Journal was like, coups abound in Africa or something, which when people actually, there was 2 research studies that took those headlines and showed them to people and said, what do you think when you hear that headline? And most people said, it tells me there's at least 40 to 50 coups in Africa this year. There weren't. There were 6. But so I'll leave it there.
No, but I have to say now that you say that, I feel that we are kind of committing the same crime here, because just in what you now said in these 5 minutes, I would comfortably be able to hold a 2-hour webinar just to unpack some of the things. And I'm itching to ask you all these questions, but I can't afford it. Unfortunately, I have to. I mean, not Miguel, don't get me wrong. Not unfortunately, I have to turn to you. But I hope we will have more time to address some of these things. But now I will turn to you, Miguel, and you come from Colombia, a country where there is now a complex peace process underway between the government and the FARC guerrillas. At the same time, negotiations around this total peace concept, while there is violence as well. Of course, Colombia is not the only country in Latin America with dynamics that make media approaches so relevant. There are other countries that deal with kind of similar issues, like Guatemala or Nicaragua, or other issues like El Salvador and others, that make the way that people consume information one of the most important factors on whether it is possible to solidify peace or whether there is more turmoil. So if you could please give us your assessment. I know that there has been a lot of work, a lot of discussion, especially in Colombia, on the role of media in the peace process. How do you see this role, especially in view of what we mentioned in the beginning, now that we see a kind of a broader journalistic foundations crumbling around us, even there where we thought we could always turn for guidance.
Thank you, Refik. I agree with Moky and that process of taking over media from big economic conglomerates is not doesn't happen only in Africa, or it happens everywhere, and we're not the exception. But I'm a bit more optimist in one sense, and that is journalism in Colombia has been very independent, and so apart from an economic conglomerate taking over a newspaper, there are amazingly courageous journalists that have been battling against the cartels, battling against corruption for many years. So it's different, that the state of the media than the state of journalism in itself. So I would say that journalism in Colombia is still quite independent, and there are many countries in Latin America where you would find something like that: Argentina, Chile, even in Mexico. But having said that, as Moky also mentioned, there is social media, and the traditional media is one thing, and some of us are interested in how traditional media curates content, and during COVID, traditional media received some more recognition. But of course, social media is taking over, and social media is in itself, because of the way the algorithms work, polarizing. And so I think that in terms of peace processes in Colombia, what you would have is moments in which society becomes polarized out of the interest of political parties, like when we had the peace referendum, where we got 50% yes and no. But in general, we've done a lot of research trying to understand the strength of the political center, and we found out that there is less polarization in society. There's more polarization in the elites and the media elites. So in a way, I'm more optimistic. One experiment that the Brain Trust, IFIT's Brain Trust in Colombia did, that was fascinating, and that is all in the the website that I invite everyone to look, of the INPG at IFIT, was to build a vocabulary to cover the elections, because elections are polarizing. Campaigns polarize to differentiate themselves from the other campaign, and that has been like that forever. Social media, of course, multiplies that and accelerates the problem. But we try to give to people who are covering the election a vocabulary to try to reveal what would be polarizing vocabulary and not polarizing vocabulary. And I think more of those experiments should be done, because those moments, peace processes, referendums, elections, are in itself polarizing. I think one last thing to mention is that we talked about this in one of the papers that we've written at INPG, is the need to have ways to finance independent media in the world. A kind of a global endowment for the independent media. Soros does some of that, but it's clearly insufficient. I do believe that having independent media and that independent media being able to finance itself beyond crowdfunding would be a good idea, to have non-polarizing media in the world.
I will have to come back to you and try to squeeze as much as I can out of this conversation before we turn it to questions from the audience. But there is one thing that I will just give as an example and ask you to reflect on it, especially in view, for instance, of what Moky said about the diversity of media in the areas that you are working, and this has to do with the Western Balkans, where the media, as it is well known, has played a very destructive role during the conflict and before the conflict of the 90s. And then because we had all these accountability mechanisms like International War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where the role of media was not as explicitly addressed as in the tribunal for Rwanda, but it was addressed in different judgments and mentioned, and the way that it laid ground for crimes against humanity and genocide, even in some judgments like Burgenin judgment, was explicitly explored. And this served as the basis for us to kind of try to reckon with the role of media in incitement, in driving conflict. And of course, this process has never been perfect. There was never a very specific mechanism to deal with. It was left to journalists to kind of self-regulate in a way. There was some soft regulation as well. Now, 25 years later, what we are seeing is a full circle. In terms of what is especially worrying for me now is that while these countries have kind of started making their progress towards accession to the EU, where there is a number of different standards, where they have to adhere to various different laws and so on and so forth, media has been kind of left out of this equation. And now it is not only that through purchasing by people with economic interests and then using media for their own agendas, it is being seen as the spoils of political wars. Those who win power, they get the media, public media, but also through various different ways of pressuring private media, through economic ways of pressuring them, they get that as well. And the discourse that we have is, if not on par, even worse than in the 90s. Dehumanization of the other, warmongering, incitement is at levels unseen even in the 90s. But now it is somehow as if it is kind of normalized, because what we are seeing in the Western Europe, unfortunately, that is what I briefly mentioned in the beginning, where dehumanization of the other, migrants, approaches to conflicts like Israel and Gaza or Ukraine, has somehow started normalizing dehumanization when it comes to certain groups. And all of a sudden, this one kind of anchor that we held on to, that we have to reform, that media has to reform in this aspect and be more like the BBC or, I don't know, CNN. All of a sudden, all these standards have started to crumble, and now it is free for all. And I think that in this context, and this is, Moky, for you, I am now starting to search for news on social media. I am now starting, I'm seeing, and on one hand, it is because I do believe that young people have some answers that we are not so eager to acknowledge and accept. But in the context of diversity that you were talking about, how do you see this? What is there a way at all to kind of address this in the context of such diversity? Is there a way to regulate or self-regulate?
Well, it's actually ironic I'm on a discussion about media, because I actually don't think that media is the biggest problem when it comes to, polarization and, encouraging conflict. Because to a certain extent, media is reflecting increasingly what is happening on social media. I see increasingly that media's role is about amplifying, it's amplification of what is already there. In the old days, 19, 20 years ago, the good old days, media made the news. Media dictated what was news. That's not the case anymore. And the danger is that if we are talking about media as if media's role, media has some role of correcting it. They do, but then I don't think they're the main perpetrator. And I think that we are doing ourselves a disservice if we don't focus on where the core of the problem is. And the core of the problem is, it's in social media, it's in the non-journalists, the people who have an agenda. Because if you look at everywhere where media or social media or something has happened in a country, and I'll take an example in, Rwanda, and I have another one for South Africa, during the genocide between the Hutsis and Tutsis, which we're not supposed to talk about anymore. But there was a very deliberate act to create this massive conflict. It was a deliberate act. It didn't happen by happenstance. It didn't happen because media happened. It happened because influential group of people decided to do it. And I feel that that's what happens. If you look at, the Ukraine, Russia, somebody decides on a narrative, and then they either pay people or they use their influence or they bring in influence to perpetuate that. And then media picks it up. So if I feel, I think there's a bit of a value chain of how this works. Media is somewhere down the line. In some countries, media might be a little bit more powerful and it happens the other way. But I'll give you a quick example of what's happening in South Africa now. I used to live in South Africa a while ago. We're coming up to another election right now. It's quite a big, important one. All elections are. But there is a party called Dudula, which started off as an anti-foreigners movement. It's now registered to run in the election as a political party. And I was looking at some of the news coverage, and these were, in international media. I think it was a Deutsche Welle story or it was an Al Jazeera story. And they were sort of looking at this story, interviewing the woman who was, talking about the party and, blaming all of South Africa's economic woes on foreigners. And the next person they went to was somebody who was saying, no, that's not how it is. So it was going from one polarizing opinion to another polarizing opinion. And for me, in a way, that sort of summed up media. Even when they try to have a counter perspective, that counter perspective is often the exact opposite of the one that they don't agree with or that's being perpetuated, which takes us back to the same point. Because even as a non-South African, because I'm not now South African, I was living in South Africa, I fundamentally disagree with Dudula. Other Africans coming in, Ethiopians, Somalians, Zimbabweans, are not the root of South Africa's problems. But listening to the other guy, I was like, well, actually, I don't agree with your take on it. So it was either or, it's either or. And when you get into a situation where it's either or, it's always a problem. So for me, to answer your question, media is not necessarily the problem and therefore not necessarily the entire solution. They have a huge role to play in terms of amplification, and I think there's a lot more media can do. But I feel that if we're going to stop this polarizing effect, this sort of either or sort of approach to storytelling, which it is, it's either or, it's black or white, there's never gray and there's no room to talk about the gray, we're not going to get to the root of the problem. And that's stopping the people who are deliberate about spreading dis and misinformation and causing the polarization, because polarization is caused. I don't think it's a, random event that happens. So let me stop there.
I will turn to you, Miguel, on this point, but from a different angle. We see that, for instance, in countries like El Salvador, powerful, charismatic leaders with an agenda are very quick, who can use social media very skillfully for their agenda, are quick to turn media to attack media as the enemies of the people. We also heard a certain orange man talk about this in a similar way somewhere else, but there is an open war against media that are embracing, let's say, the editorial process in terms of making sure that they report ethically and so on. They are seen as the greatest enemy of people, or they are portrayed that way. And social media is being elevated as the only source of information you need. Don't listen to them. What does that do for the role of media in countries like this, and how do you fight this? How do you address this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I do agree with Moky that media is not the problem, and that polarization is a result of a political decision rather than a tactical effect of the instrument of information. But so there are two different moments of media, at least in Latin America. One is the moment where media is critical to power and independent enough to be able to tell Bukele, you're violating human rights, or to tell Correa, you have a lot of corruption and you want to stay in power against law, or Ortega saying, you became a dictator. And then there's a moment of the media where it's taken over by the powers to be, by those autocratic presidents, and suddenly the media completely disappears as an independent factor and becomes just an political campaign. You have to use either 21st century tactics or 19th century tactics. So digital or mouth to mouth, because radio, television, papers, all taken by the Chavistas and the Maduro regime. And so I think that independent media plays a role in balancing autocrats and balancing authoritarian regimes. It's very important. It still is very important. And it's so important that what these guys do when they come into power is they attack exactly those guys, the independent journalists and the media that they represent. Now, I think there are other moments in media where you don't have this completely polarized thing where, for example, López Obrador in Mexico, every morning he blasts the traditional media. And that's what Maduro what Chavez used to do then. Maduro doesn't do now because all the media is his. I think that again, with this idea that we discussed at some point in one of the papers that we wrote, there should be some kind of a world endowment for independent media. That doesn't solve, I think, and that comes to what Moky said before. That doesn't solve the biggest problem, which is social media. The algorithms of social media are the perfect instrument of polarizing strategies, and polarizing strategies are the way to get into power, to dehumanize your adversary, and to take over power and stay there forever.